Lovely to see everybody. Good afternoon. Well, it's afternoon for me, maybe morning, I realize, for some of you, but it's lovely to see you all. So yeah, we have a lot, it's a big world, and we have a lot to cover today. So I'm going to launch straight into it. As you've heard, today is the first of three parts. We're talking about changing Israel and a changing West, but just so you have the dates that Cheryl already mentioned. So next week we'll talk about changing Israel and the great power competition, and then in 2 weeks' time, changing Israel and a changing Middle East. So these sessions are kind of linked together, though of course they're kind of all stand alone also. And I kind of want to begin by setting a context, perhaps at the global level, even though that the great power competition aspect is something we'll talk a bit more about next week. It's to set a kind of global context, or to kind of present what's the kind of big theme or big argument of the sessions this week and over the next 2 weeks is we're in a world of dynamic change, a world of growing contestation, competition at a global level and at regional levels, and also we're in a time of great deep social division within the state of Israel. And so the big theme that I'm interested in these presentations is how the divides that are taking place within the state of Israel are affecting how Israel responds to these divisions and divides and contestations that we see within the West, within the Middle East, and also at the global level. And just thinking at the global level, I'm going to flash up a map here, and people are invited to sort of tell me if they know what this map signifies. Anybody, if they want to pop it into the chat, what this map signifies. If anybody knows, they can pop it into the chat. It's a kind of a interactive question. Give a minute for anybody that responds. And I see straight away a response: Silk Route, Silk Road, which is, I think, close to the answer that I'm expecting or looking for. There's a migration routes, trade routes. It is to do with trade routes. Okay, it's something slightly more specific. This map signifies or represents something called the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. What is the Belt and Road Initiative? It's a huge global set of infrastructure projects financed and pushed forward by the Chinese government, the purpose of which is to ensure trade routes for China to export its goods around the world, but also to ensure access to China for the incoming flow of raw materials, energy, minerals, things that China needs. So why do I flash up this map just as an introduction to these three sessions? The big story of global politics today and then over the coming decades is the growing competition between the United States and China. But within that kind of global level competition, there's all kinds of other competitions and contestations going on at regional levels also. And those contestations, those conflicts that we see at a global level are, I think, about two kinds of things. One is material stuff. So things like who controls access to resources like energy and raw materials, who manufactures what and where, who gets to sell and trade what and where, who has access to different kinds of trade routes, who controls what kinds of technologies and what kinds of weapons. These are the big stuff of international politics and strategic competition. So it's about that kind of material stuff. But the contestation at a global level is not just about that kind of material competition. It's also about an ideas competition. And I'm going to signify that with my next slide, where you're going to see an image from a summit between two important world leaders, Xi Jinping, the premier of China, and of course, President Putin of Russia, a summit that took place in early 2022, just before Russia invaded Ukraine. And at this summit, they issued a very long joint statement. These two leaders included all kinds of stuff. But one of the things they said, you see the paragraph, I'm going to read it from the screen. The sides, Russia and China, believe that the advocacy of democracy and human rights must not be used to put pressure on other countries. They oppose the abuse of democratic values and interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states under the pretext of protecting democracy and human rights. And any attempt to incite divisions and confrontation in the world, the sides call on the international community to respect cultural and civilizational diversity and the rights of peoples of different countries to self-determination. So I'm going to talk more about this next week, but I just flag it up now because what I'm signifying here is that there is a competition also at the level of ideas. What kind of ideas will shape the international order in the future? Will it be the ideas that the West has been promoting, liberal internationalism, global human rights regimes, deep international cooperation? Or will it be the ideas of these authoritarian rivals to Western democracies like Russia and China, for whom these ideas of a global spread of democracy are, of course, very challenging and very threatening. So we have a contest over ideas also at a global level, but not only at a global level. So we have a challenge to Western ideas of liberal democracy and liberal internationalism at a global level, but we also have a challenge to those ideas within Western societies. And that's going to be one of the themes of today's session. And I'm signifying that just by flashing up this image here. And many of you will recognize the figures that you see at the top of the image there. Most of you, in fact, I'm sure all of you will. And most of you, perhaps many of you, will recognize the figures that you see at the bottom of the image also. So at the top, of course, you'll all recognize Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. At the bottom there, I'm guessing many of you will certainly recognize the French President Emmanuel Macron. And many of you, I'm sure, will recognize also to the right there, in that photo montage, the leader of the French radical right Rassemblement National Party, what was the Front National, Marine Le Pen, daughter of the infamously anti-Semitic leader of the radical right in France, Jean-Marie Le Pen. And on the left of the image, some of you may recognize Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of the radical left bloc in the French Parliament. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these characters, but what this image is signifying is that there is a deep ideological divide, deepening and growing ideological divide within Western societies about who we are, what our values are, what we stand for. And you see it in the United States, of course, many of you, but we see it in Europe also. And I'm also just kind of previewing here, we see a deep divide in the Middle East that's different but related to those other divides that I've mentioned. And that's going to be the topic really of our third lecture. And of course, we're seeing it playing out in a live regional conflict, devastating conflict that began on October the 7th, which isn't just a conflict inside the Gaza Strip, it's a regional level conflict between Iran and its proxies, who are rivals with a bloc of or states that are more aligned with Western political agendas. So we'll talk more about that in the third session. So the question is really how these divides at a global level and within the West and within the Middle East are interacting with deep divides taking place inside the state of Israel. And that's what I want to focus on for a moment now as a kind of introduction, part of the introduction for this lecture, but also relevant to the lectures for next week and the week after. So I'm going to present here very briefly a framework for understanding the deep divide taking place within the state of Israel. And this framework really mostly applies to divisions that we saw in Israel before the outbreak of the devastating war that began on October 7th, the awful, heinous attack by Hamas inside Israel, the slaughter of 1,200 Israelis, the kidnapping of 215 to the Gaza Strip, and the terrible consequences that you're extremely familiar with. Prior to the outbreak of war, Israel, as you will recall, was struck with deep, unprecedented level of internal division and internal conflict. And although that internal conflict was somewhat suppressed in the context of the war, we see increasingly over recent months, and especially over recent days, that conflict bursting back into the open again. And I think it's important to try very briefly to kind of have a framework for understanding what that conflict within the state of Israel is about, because it affects how Israel responds to these deep divides happening at a global level. So the way I understand the deep divides in Israel is in kind of three levels. Firstly, we have an immediate political crisis inside the state of Israel. And I don't think it's possible to understand that crisis without understanding the fundamental political fact that the Prime Minister Netanyahu is on trial. Now, why is that important? Why does that shape the political crisis? because it's taken all the flexibility out of the Israeli political system, because many political parties that would otherwise go into coalition with Netanyahu refuse to do so because he is on trial. And that means that Netanyahu is reliant on ultra-Orthodox parties, but also on far-right parties to form a governing coalition, because those are the only ones that are willing to serve in coalition with him while he is on trial. That fundamental fact of Netanyahu being on trial has facilitated, therefore, the entry of the far right into a governing coalition in the state of Israel, and has also facilitated what was called a judicial reform, or by its critics, kind of judicial overhaul or revolution or even coup, a set of measures that the Israeli opposition argue is fundamentally challenging or threatening to democracy in the state of Israel. That's the part of the immediate political crisis. And then, of course, that was pre-October the 7th. Since October the 7th, we have a divide related to this immediate political crisis, which is over the question of how to end the war. And we see, particularly in recent days, how that divide about how to end the war corresponds to those deep division that we saw in relation to the immediate political crisis, pro-Netanyahu, anti-Netanyahu, the judicial overhaul, and associated issues. But that immediate political crisis sits within a much deeper and wider divide within Israel about what kind of country Israel should be. And that's that second box there, the deep-lying social and ideological divide. And it's a divide that's complex, but if I sort of try to simplify it, I characterize it as a divide between those that wish to maintain a balance between the Jewish character of the state of Israel and the liberal and democratic character of the state of Israel, and those that wish to prioritize or emphasize or raise up the Jewish ethnic or religious, Orthodox Jewish religious character of the state of Israel above the liberal and democratic character of the state of Israel, okay, represented by the members of the current coalition. So that's part of what that deep divide is about what kind of state do we want to be. And you may also notice that that corresponds to divides that we see in some other Western societies as well. But it's also a divide also about rights, responsibilities, and resources, who pays taxes, who serves in the military, and that kind of thing as well. So it's ideological, but it's also interests between different sectors in Israeli society. So that deep divide inside Israel about what kind of country are we, how much are we a Jewish state, and how much are we a democratic state, sits within a global set of divides that I've also referred to, what I'm referring to on this screen here in that third box, the global crisis of liberal democracy. Because we see not only in Israel, but in many multi-party democracies, a backlash against globalization, a rise of conservative nationalism challenging liberal internationalism, and we see deep polarization and fragmentation due to social media. So some of those things that we're seeing happen in Israel are not just happening in Israel, they correspond to things happening in other multi-party democracies, a wider global crisis of what was previously a kind of consensus around the values of liberal democracy. Now, how does that deep divide in the state of Israel, I think, influences or shapes different responses to all kinds of issues? And for shortage of time, I'm going to be very just touch on the headlines here. Those deep divides in Israel cause divisions or relate to divisions about what should be the relation between religion and state in the state of Israel. They impact divisions on, again, I mentioned the issue of rights and responsibilities, who serves in the military, who pays taxes, the issue particularly of ultra-Orthodox in the military, very divisive in Israel. Those divides shape different responses to dilemmas about Israel and its neighborhood. So the Palestinian question, obviously, whereas those that prioritize or want to hold on to Israel's liberal and democratic character alongside its Jewish character emphasize the importance of separating from the Palestinians, tend to support a two-state solution, at least prior to October the 7th. And that affects also the extent to which they're willing to make compromises and concessions at a regional level to bring about normalization agreements with Arab states, Saudi Arabia, for example. And those divides in Israel also relate to Israel's relations with the wider world. And that's kind of the theme of this sessions and the ones over the next couple of weeks. So thinking about those questions about how those divides inside Israel relate to those divides taking place within Western societies, let's think first about some of the divisions within Western societies. Let's think about attitudes of Western states towards the state of Israel at a kind of broad level. And to think about how different states relate to Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian arena, if we want to look across states at the same moment, then perhaps there's no better place to do that than at the United Nations. So here I'm flashing up an image from a vote that happened in the UN General Assembly in December in relation to the current conflict. A resolution that expressed, as you can see on the screen, grave concern about the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, demanded an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, demanded all parties comply with obligations under international law, and demanded the unconditional release of all hostages. Now, Israel lobbied hard against this resolution. It, first of all, didn't condemn Hamas, and it didn't like, of course, that it called for an immediate ceasefire when Israel was prosecuting a war to destroy Hamas and return its hostages. So Israel lobbied hard against this resolution, but how did it do? Well, you can see the results on the screen there. 153 votes in favor of the resolution, 10 against, and 23 abstentions. So as a measure of Israel's diplomatic clout of the UN, it's not a great result. It's not very surprising. UN General Assembly resolutions tend to go this way, and you might be familiar with some of those challenges that Israel has faced for many decades in the UN. But I'm not interested so much in that. I'm interested in the question about who voted against and who abstained. So which states actually aligned to some extent with Israel's diplomatic preferences. And I'm particularly interested in Western states, since that's the theme of this session, and particularly European states. We'll talk a bit more about the US, and you might be able to guess that the US was one of the states that voted against this resolution. The US is, of course, the foremost diplomatic supporter in the UN, both in the General Assembly and in the Security Council. But if I was to ask you which European states voted against the resolution, maybe Shiro, maybe we can open the chat again and give people an opportunity. Can you guess which states abstained or voted against this resolution in line with Israel's preferences? If we're thinking about European states, members of the EU and the UK, where I am, which is no longer a member of the EU, but is an important European state. Anybody want to hazard a guess? You can type in the chat. You can have a guess which European states you think might have abstained or voted against this resolution. I'm seeing some guesses here. Germany, Finland. I'm seeing a guess for Hungary. Anyone else want to have a guess? Okay, let's see. Let's see the results. So a couple of those guesses were oh, Italy, I see also. Okay, well done. So let's see. And now you see the results on screen. Okay, you can see the green marks indicate those states voting in favor, the overwhelming majority. In red, you see those voted against. In Europe, 2 states voted against. They were Austria and the Czech Republic. And those European states that abstained, while those that guessed Italy, Hungary, and Germany were correct, others were, and the Netherlands also abstained, as did the United Kingdom. Now, I don't want to get too much into why these individual states voted the way they did. What I'm interested in is the fact that out of the European Union, you have, okay, most states voted for the resolution, but you have some that abstained, some that voted against. And the puzzle in a way is, why are these European states kind of all over the place? You might be aware that in the European Union, there's a kind of an agreement between the 27 European states that are members of the EU to try and they have something called the Common Foreign and Security Policy, which is an agreement to try and align their foreign policies. So they try to coordinate and cooperate exactly on these kinds of questions. But what happened? Some states voted for, some states voted for, some states abstained, and some states voted against. So that common foreign and security policy of the European Union apparently doesn't work terribly well, at least not when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian question. And I can illustrate that further with this graph here.
Toby?
Yeah.
Just stopping you for a moment, can you summarize in a sentence or two what this resolution was that people were voting for and against?
Yeah. So the resolution was demanding a humanitarian ceasefire, demanding that all parties comply with obligations under international law, and demanding an immediate and unconditional release of hostages. And
And
why did Israel...
Just a question, because I think it's important for this time. People were asking, why would anyone vote against this? So just...
Okay, so Israel was lobbying to vote against it. Why? Because it did not condemn Hamas. And also because they were opposed to, they did not want international pressure for a ceasefire. So that's why. So that's why Israel was pushing against this resolution. And its supporters either abstained or voted against. Okay? So thanks for the question. Okay. So here on this graph, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, it's just an illustration. It's created by an Israeli think tank called Vim. But what does it show? It shows where European Union states stand in relation to Israel. You can see on the left there, those more critical of Israel. You see on the right, those most aligned with Israel. And you see in the middle what the Vim, this Israeli think tank, calls balances. And what you see basically is that this map, this graph, is a bit of a mess. European Union states all over the place. Okay, they don't have a consensus or an agreement on the Israeli-Palestinian question. Some more supportive of Israel, some more critical of Israel, some more balanced in the middle. So just looking, without getting into too much of the details state by state, again, an opportunity on the chat if you want to throw in some suggestions. Why might one state be in one position and one state be in another position? What kinds of issues might cause a state to be more pro-Israel, more critical of Israel, or more balanced? What kinds of issues might cause a state? Why is, we see Sweden and Ireland, for example, on one side. We see the Czech Republic and Hungary on another. We see Germany and Britain in the middle there. What might cause these states to take the kind of different positions that they take, to be more diplomatically supportive or more critical of Israel? I'm seeing a couple of suggestions in the screen. I'm not sure everybody, I think you do all see them all. Okay, so is demographic change, Muslim immigration, Muslim population a factor, past history? Yeah, it's somebody suggested it's democratic, that different nations have a different view. Yes, of course, the UN is a democratic system. Absolutely. Population, demographics, and history, financial relationships, so kind of economic interests might be a factor there. Internal political considerations, internal politics, yes, interesting also. Yes, I think all those are who is in power, right? So perhaps the party in government might be relevant. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Absolutely. So, okay, many different factors there. And there are others as well. All kinds of different political interests that different European states have, and all kinds of different domestic political agendas as well. And in some cases, of course, history, culture, very significant as well. It's really, really difficult to pin down individual European states at any moment in time. This picture that you see on the screen right now is not static. In fact, it's extremely dynamic. It's changing all the time. And it's changing for at least two reasons. One is the reality is changing all the time. We're in a very, very dynamic international situation. There's two strips of images you see there. One signifies dramatic changes taking place in the Middle East, and including the Abraham Accords, the rise of the far right in Israel, devastating events of October the 7th and the war afterwards, an image representing the Houthi intervention in the Red Sea. We also see dramatic changes taking place in Europe. Uncontrolled waves of migration, symbolized, you see by the image of the boat there. Of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, transforming the European security environment, political polarization within European states, I've already mentioned, and social change, accelerating a kind of grassroots pro-Palestinian movement in many European states as well as in the United States, as you're familiar with. So dramatic changes taking place both in the region, in the Middle East, and in Europe, meaning that considerations of states, their interests, their security interests, their domestic political interests, changing all the time. But there's another reason why we see dynamic change, and that is because of, and some of you alluded to it in your responses to my question, these deep internal polarizations, political polarizations happening within European states, which I've already alluded to and already mentioned. So if formerly in Western liberal democracies, both in the United States and in Europe, we had a kind of centrist consensus behind the idea that the West stands for liberal democracy, Enlightenment values, democracy, rule of law, human rights, kind of cultural pluralism, also that being the kind of mainstream centrist idea represented by the mainstream values of the European Union, by centrist political leaders in the US, like President Biden, perhaps Kamala Harris, President Macron in France. That consensus is challenged today both from the radical left and from the radical right, both in the United States and in Europe. There is an alternative on the radical right that feels that the native culture is threatened by non-native cultures, and in the European context, especially Islam, is a particularly important issue for the radical right in Europe today. And they want to reaffirm traditional social values relating to family, to gender, and they want to oppose the transfer of sovereign power to international institutions like the EU or the UN. They're opposed to international institutions telling sovereign states what to do. And we see that in the case of Trump in the US also. But there's also a challenge from the radical left. And it's signified on the screen by the image of the Squad, a kind of progressive wing of the Democratic Party that you'll be familiar with in the US, or Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France. There is a concept, a challenge that Western liberal democracy is some kind of fraud, that it's a cover for elitist capitalism and imperialism or neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism, and this idea that anything that actually challenges Western power in the world is essentially has some kind of legitimacy to it because Western power is somehow illegitimate and corrupt and exploitative. So big challenges to the former mainstream consensus about liberal democracy within Western societies. And so with those increasing domestic divides, those increasing polarizations, we also see polarizations of attitudes towards Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian arena. You're familiar with it, I think, in the United States. I'm just going to illustrate this a little bit more with the case of France. Here you see some captions on screen that illustrate different ways that French politicians have responded to the war that erupted on October the 7th. Top left there, you see a headline from an interview with the radical left French leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon, where he said, in Gaza, this isn't legitimate self-defense, it's a genocide. He's referring to Israeli actions as a genocide. And the caption there says, in France, Jean-Luc Mélenchon has been accused of anti-Semitism for his opposition to Israel's relentless siege on Gaza. In this interview, he explains why the left must assert a universalist anti-racism in the face of Europe's accelerating slide to the far right. So not just critical of Israel on the radical left in France, but accusing Israel of genocide. In the center of the image there, you see a headline, President Macron tells Netanyahu Gaza war must end. His mum is silent on freeing hostages as a condition. The French president backs ceasefire proposals announced by Biden, places onus on Hamas to accept it, commits to finding a diplomatic solution to the crisis with Hezbollah. So the center in Europe, represented by Macron, very much aligned with the position of Biden in the United States, critical of Israel's actions, in principle asserts Israel's right to defend itself, but critical of the way Israel's gone about that, and also pushing for a ceasefire deal, certainly not accusing Israel of genocide like Mélenchon is. And then on the right, bottom right there, you see a headline from the Financial Times, why Marine Le Pen ran to Israel's defense unlike her father. Far-right leader seeks to rid her party of its anti-Semitic past as far-left botches its response. So you see this signifying that Marine Le Pen, on the radical right of French politics, has actually, certainly in the early stages of the war, defended Israel, attacked the left for failing to adequately condemn Hamas or support Israel's right to defend itself. And this piece, this last bit, this role of the radical right, the position of the radical right, is something that we might find particularly puzzling and something we might want to think just a little bit more about. Because, of course, what we know about the history of the radical right, only in France, but in Europe more widely, is, of course, it has deep anti-Semitic roots. And those roots don't go that far back. Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, the former leader of the French radical right, notoriously anti-Semitic. And yet today, his daughter, Marine Le Pen, distances herself from anti-Semitism and positions herself, relatively speaking, defending Israel and attacking the radical left its position and accusing the radical, and it's the radical left that is being accused of anti-Semitism. So why is that the case? Why do we find a shift in the radical right from a historic position of anti-Semitism to today positioning itself as sort of defending Israel? And depends on the radical right leader that we're talking about. There's a great variation between different radical right leaders and parties, but many of them in Europe really positioning themselves as strong defenders of Israel. And I think it's a couple of motivations there. I think there is a motivation on the part of the radical right today to distance itself from its anti-Semitic past, which was, of course, toxic. As I mentioned, today, for the radical right in Europe, Jews do not really pose a threat from their worldview to the ethnic integrity or values of Europe. Of course, there are not many Jews in Europe today because of the legacy of the Holocaust that we're all very familiar with. And today they frame and define Muslims or Islamization as the threat to the cultural integrity of Europe. And from that perspective, they can distance themselves from that toxic anti-Semitic past by positioning themselves as supportive of Israel. And they can accuse Muslims and the left in Europe as being the real kind of anti-Semites and flip that kind of toxic anti-Semitic label onto their political opponents. And in some cases, I think ideologically it goes even further. I'm just going to jump a few slides and illustrate with one example. This is Geert Wilders, a radical right leader in the Netherlands, leader of the largest political party in the Netherlands today. He gave an interview to Israeli newspaper, the Jerusalem Post, just a few weeks ago. He said, "We should support the country that shares our values." He's talking about Israel. "And if you will be lost, you Israel, we will be next." I truly believe that. Israel is the only democracy, the only country that shares our values, that we share our values within the Middle East. So we share our values, and I believe Judeo-Christian values, besides humanistic values, are something that we should be proud of. You are, as I often say, a beacon of light in an area of darkness. So Wilders, in this quotation, and it illustrates an example of something we tend to see more broadly, frames Israel as being kind of cultural kin to the Judeo-Christian values of Europe, in a sense, Europe's front line against the threat posed by Islamic extremism, and so there's a kind of ideological framework for this this sort of flip in these European radical right from anti-Semitism to a kind of pro-Israel position. And we see echoes of that kind of language, that language about Judeo-Christian values, or this idea of a Judeo-Christian West, which includes Israel, in opposition to the threat of Islamic extremism or Islam. We see some of that language also sometimes in the United States. Just flashing up an example from Steve Bannon, influential, of course, on the US right, referring to the long history of the Judeo-Christian West struggle against Islam. Of course, there are some differences between Europe and the United States in this regard. In the US, of course, you don't have on the right such a need to kind of try and distance from a kind of anti-Semitic legacy, but of course you have the strong influence of the evangelical Christian movement, not such a significant political factor in Europe. And of course you have the sense in the United States that pro-Israel politics is pro-American politics. And pro-Israel is deeply rooted in US political culture. And of course, you see this illustrated at the bottom of the screen. Donald Trump, when he was president, really strongly played to that base, that evangelical base, by moving the US embassy to Jerusalem and many other steps which were aligned with the wishes and agenda of Netanyahu and the Israeli right. So amidst all these changes taking place in the West, how should Israel respond to that? And I think we see two different trends in Israel, shaped by that Israeli divide that I mentioned earlier. We have a divide between those, I think, represented in the current coalition, represented, of course, first and foremost by Netanyahu, who really embrace want to embrace the radical right as allies to their interests, and embrace this idea that Israel is the sort of front line of the Judeo-Christian West against the threats posed by militant Islam, as you see referred to in the quotation at the top of the screen in a speech Netanyahu gave to a Christians United for Israel conference in the US in 2017, or in the terms of the quotation in a remarks that Netanyahu made to some European leaders that same year: we are part of the European culture, Europe ends in Israel. So really playing into this idea, yes, we are the front line of Western civilization, Judeo-Christian civilization against Islamic extremism. And you see Netanyahu pictured at the bottom there with Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And the fact that Viktor Orban, a conservative nationalist, a populist nationalist leader in Hungary, who himself stands accused of using anti-Semitic dog whistles, for example, his attacks on the Hungarian Jewish American financier George Soros, which are regarded by many as kind of being coded anti-Semitic dog whistles, those kind of accusations don't concern Netanyahu. Netanyahu sees political allies who can blunt pressure internationally on Israel, in particular over the Palestinian issue. And so he's really fostered relations with the radical right, with Trump in the United States, but also leaders like Viktor Orban in Europe. But there are others in Israel who are much more cautious and not so enthusiastic about that response. One is the former president, Ruby Rivlin, for example, who was rather critical. And you see this highlighted in a letter that he wrote to Austrian Jewish leaders in 2017, where he quoted from himself in a speech to Holocaust Memorial Day, where he rejected attempts to create alliances with political parties and other groups that support xenophobia and anti-Semitism, while at the same time displaying apparent support for the state of Israel. He rejected those kinds of political alliances. But also we see the objection to that political strategy from Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid when he was foreign minister and then prime minister. The first day in his job as foreign minister in 2021, in the Bennett-Lapid government that replaced Netanyahu for a year, he said in a speech to Israeli diplomats, with countries of the European Union, our situation is not good enough. Our relationship with too many governments has been neglected and become hostile. Shouting that everyone is anti-Semitic isn't a policy or a work plan, even if it sometimes feels right. I spoke last night with EU Representative Josep Borrell, with President Macron. We all think it's time to improve the dialogue between Israel and Europe. But this was a very clear sign that Lapid wants to reach out, not to the kind of radical right or conservative nationalist leaders in Europe, but to those mainstream, more centrist, liberal democratic leaders in Israel. And also with respect to the United States, he said the outgoing government took a terrible gamble to focus exclusively on the Republican Party and abandon Israel's bipartisan standing. We find ourselves with a Democratic White House. We need to change the way we work with them. And he said the same is true with the Jewish community in the US. It's time for us to change. The support of Christian evangelicals and other groups is important and heartwarming, but the Jewish people are more than allies. They are family. Jews from all streams, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, are our family. He was concerned to kind of rebuild relations with progressive Jews, particularly in the United States, and create a more broad-based or restore a more broad-based bipartisan support for Israel in the US. And what is Lapid and others concerned about? I think a few things. One is illustrated in this graph here. It shows American public opinion. On the left-hand side there, you see a red line representing Republicans and a blue line representing Democrats, and it indicates sympathy for Israel. Okay, so you see, whereas in the 1970s, there wasn't much gap between Republicans and Democrats. Today, there is a huge partisan gap. Republicans are much more likely to be supportive of Israel, and Democrats much less likely to be supportive of Israel. And we also see a huge age gap. On the right-hand side there, you see survey data on attitudes towards Israel who have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of Israel. And you see that young people, those aged 18 to 29, 56% have an unfavorable opinion of Israel, much less than for older age groups. So we have a party gap and a generation gap on attitudes towards Israel. So the likes of Lapid might be concerned about that. They might also be concerned about headlines like this one. How much is Biden's support of Israel hurting him with young voters? The US election coming up in the US. Could Biden, now Kamala Harris, lose votes among young progressive voters who are now, as we've seen in the previous survey, much less likely to be favorable to Israel, much more critical of Israel? So that's a concern. And another reason for it to be concerned with the strategy of kind of investing in relations with the increasingly radical right in the US and in Europe is that how reliable is the radical right as a political ally, thinking in particular about the case of Trump. You see a few images that might cause that cause us to question that reliability. The image at the top there is an image of Donald Trump with Kanye West, who has become a notorious for his anti-Semitic outbursts, and apparently was invited to dinner with Trump just a few months ago. There is a affinity or apparent affiliation between kind of conspiratorial thinking on the far right in Europe and Trump's own political agenda. Another concern is that Trump got very cross with Netanyahu because Netanyahu acknowledged Biden's victory in the US election, leading to some very strong comments that Trump made about Netanyahu, indicating kind of Trump is obviously a leader who is somewhat capricious in his nature. If you cross him, then you can't rely on kind of deep-rooted ideological commitment to his support. And the third item you see on the screen there, Republican opposition to Israeli aid is the latest headache for the pro-Israel community, alluding to the fact that there is an isolationist tendency for Republicans in the US. We saw it in relation to the difficulty in getting Republican support for military and economic aid for Ukraine. In the future, could that also apply to Israel? Could Republicans who say, it's America first, why do we waste our resources sending military aid overseas? Today, that doesn't apply so much to Israel, but could it in the future? Perhaps some hints of concerns about that. So a deep divide in Israel about how to respond to these deep divides taking place in the West, and in this year of election and political change across the world, in the European Parliament, in the UK, of course, coming up in the United States, perhaps also an election to come in Israel before too long. The question going forward is, what will be this interaction between changes in the nature of Western politics and changes taking place in Israel also? Okay, I'll pause there and give an opportunity for questions.
Wow, thank you so much. So there are a few different questions. Some of them are more about information. Some of them are about opinions. So I'll just start and throwing them at you. One is it possible to be pro-Israel and anti-Semitic? Because from what you described, it's almost possible these days. So if you can comment about that.
So that's a really interesting question. One of the things that we saw or seem to see over the last few years on the part of Netanyahu was that we saw him embrace or build relations with the political leaders that were accused of anti-Semitism, or at least caused concerns of anti-Semitism in their own countries. But from Netanyahu's perspective, seen from the perspective of Netanyahu and his supporters, if they were diplomatically supportive of Israel, that's what counted. I think from the perspective of those political actors themselves, I think support for Israel has become an important instrument, an important signal about them distancing themselves from anti-Semitism. So I think again, the answer to that question would depend where you stand in the internal divide in Israel. I think for Netanyahu and his supporters, that Israel, to be supportive of Israel, is the critical factor in terms of Jewish welfare, whereas on the part of perhaps of what is currently the Israeli opposition, that other concerns should also be taken into account and include the concerns of local Jewish communities, whether in European states or the United States.
So a few questions that are also opinions, but information. What's your opinion on who's better for Israel? Is it in terms of U.S. politics? Is it Harris or Trump, and why?
So I have my own opinion on that, but I'm wondering whether I should try to give a more kind of what are the arguments? What would if you did a survey of Israeli public opinion today, I think that most Israelis would still say that Trump is better for Israel. And what do they see? They see the way that Trump gave such strong diplomatic support to the positions of the Israeli government, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, recognizing Israeli sovereignty in the Golan. He was very tough on the Palestinians when they didn't go along with his diplomatic, when they didn't like his decision to move the US embassy to Jerusalem, and he initiated a peace proposal very much in line with the agenda of Netanyahu. And of course, he was successful and his administration was successful in brokering the Abraham Accords. What would be the argument against that? That actually unfettered support for the positions of the Israeli right is not necessarily in the interest of Israel as a whole. If you believe that Israel's interests are actually in trying to reach a diplomatic solution with the Palestinians and ultimately separating from the Palestinians so that you can reach, so that you can secure Israel's future as both a Jewish and a democratic state, then unfettered support for the Israeli right is not necessarily what Israel needs from the United States. In fact, what Israel needs is a US that is engaged in trying to secure an agreement which preserves Israel as a Jewish democracy. So again, that fundamental divide that I described within Israeli society affects how you would answer that question.
I'll just ask you to stop share so that we have you on full screen.
Yes, thank you. You'll do that.
Would you care to share your own opinion about this? Since people did ask also for your opinion. So if you're okay with sharing your opinion.
Well, look, so since you asked, it may not surprise you that if in the divide that I described, I am on one side of that divide. I personally value liberal democracy alongside Israel being the nation state of the Jewish people. So I align with those people currently in the opposition in Israel, the want to maintain Israel's Jewish character, but also its liberal and democratic character. So my own view is that Israel's interests are in finding a resolution to the Palestinian question, ultimately based on getting back on the road towards a two-state solution that will preserve Israel's liberal democratic character alongside its Jewish character. That's my own position. So yes, I am on one side of this divide myself, but the fact that you're asking me gives me actually encourages me that I somehow managed to reflect it, perhaps without it being obvious that I have a position.
Another question is about the relationship between Israeli Jewry and diaspora Jewry, and if you can say something about how this war is changing and shifting in terms of age groups in American Jewry, and how you see that moving in the future.
Yeah, so this is a big concern. I'm sure it's a concern in the United States. It's certainly a concern here in the UK, not just in the context of the current war, but over say the last 10, 20 years, maybe even longer. These deep divides that are taking place in Israel are also causing deep divides for Jews in the diaspora, inevitably. And those break down over religious, Orthodox versus progressive streams of Judaism. There are also significant generational divides as well. And young Jews in the United States or the United Kingdom are not separate from the wider trends that are happening in their society. They're influenced by them also. And I think it's a deep challenge that, whereas in the past, we saw Israel in the diaspora perhaps as a source of unity and pride. Today, increasingly, because of the deep divides taking place in the state of Israel and the political trends in the state of Israel, Israel is a deep source of anxiety and division for many diaspora Jews, and that's a deep concern, I think, for diaspora Jewish communities.
Okay, I'm going to just try and get as many questions as I can. Are there any players within the Israeli political arena that are emerging now that we might not know of? Since, I mean, Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, we know those players. Are there any new players emerging that we might want to look at?
So the Israeli political system is kind of hyper dynamic. If you know, the political system reinvents itself for every new election, and of course, there's strong anticipation that an election will come in Israel and many votes will shift because there's huge disappointment and indeed anger in Netanyahu and his coalition, both because of the divisive judicial legislation and because of the failures associated with the war. And that creates a lot of opportunity for new players to enter the political system, or for old players to re-enter the political system. Currently, the individual who is polling most strongly in a sort of head-to-head, who would you like to be prime minister versus Netanyahu, is the former prime minister Naftali Bennett, who is currently out of the political system and out of the Knesset, but seems to be well placed if he wants to make a comeback. And he's a figure, of course, on the right. If you look on the left, Yair Golan is now leading a new unified left party, a kind of new union of Labour and Meretz called HaDemokratim, the Democrats. Yair Golan is a former deputy chief of staff of the IDF. He is a military hero. He also acted heroically on October the 7th, picking up a rifle and going off to fight terrorists and save young people in the orchards of southern Israel from terrorists, and so he may help improve the fortunes of the Israeli left. So those are a couple of names to look out.
Okay, I'll just say that Golan is flanked on his sides by Rabbi Gilad Kariv of the Reform Movement and Na'ama Lazimi, which is an interesting reflection to the Jewish diaspora relations. What do you think about the U.S. campus protests and the balance between, or the challenge of the balance between free speech and hate speech, and where that's leading us to?
Yeah, so obviously those campus protests, you saw them in the United States, and we saw them here in the United Kingdom as well, including on the LSE, where I've been a visiting fellow this last year, and it illustrates that deep polarization taking place in Western societies that I've been referring to. And those campus protests, motivated in many cases by that kind of ideology kind of left ideologies that tend to kind of have a very negative view of the West and its international role, and that influences, of course, interpretations of the Israeli-Palestinian arena. Of course, in the US, it's been a particularly acute issue about free speech. I think it's something, in a way, rather specific to the US, but we're, of course, I think, an extremely shocking moment. And of course, you'll all remember the moment in Congress where the three heads of three prominent US universities seemed unable to answer a question about whether inciting or calling for genocide against Jews was against their I forget the exact but against the regulations of their campuses. I think that moment is triggering a backlash that's in the academia more widely, and I think the events of the last year are causing many to question how far ideologically charged positions have come to dominate, particularly humanities and social sciences faculties in US and indeed UK universities. And I think we're going to see a big ideological battle going forward over many of these issues that's going to shape, I think, our intellectual environment, our intellectual world, certainly for academics, but I think for wider society for many years into the future. And I think, these are struggles that we're going to be that are going to shape our political and social context for many years to come.
So I'm gonna go a little over time just because there's a few more questions. A follow-up for this one is a notion that, or at least a notion coming from Israeli and Palestinian people in many ways, that the Western, mainly American progressive left is completely detached from what's happening here on the ground. Can you comment about that?
Yeah, I think that absolutely reflects how Israelis feel about it. I think, and there is a huge gap in perception between how Israelis on the whole understand what's happening on the ground and how people in, following the conflict through Western media understand it, and even more so, and this is particularly significant for the younger generation, people who are following the conflict through social media. So the fragmentation of media, obviously there's a big difference between national media, between the media in Israel, which is a party to the conflict, which is fighting a war of self-defense and national survival from the perspective of Israelis, and the way that this conflict is depicted in the international media. Obviously there is a big gap, but even within Western societies, there is highly fragmented media. Within Israel, there is a highly fragmented media. And of course, social media is hyper fragmented. So what it means is we're not all seeing the same conflict. We are seeing the conflict represented and interpreted in different ways, tailored to our own ideological preferences and our own ideological attitudes. And that is deepening the polarization between Israel and many people observing in the West, but also within Israel and within Western societies.
Okay, another question about if you can comment about the UK government current positions on Israel, the influences of Brexit on this position. A light one.
I'm sorry, just say the question again.
Yes, if you can comment about the UK government current positions on Israel in the recent weeks and the influences of Brexit, if any, on these positions.
So obviously we're now 3-4 years on from Brexit. Brexit has had big implications for British foreign policy on the whole, but perhaps not dramatically change Britain's position in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian arena. What is more significant is the change of government in Israel. In the UK, from a conservative government to a Labour government. Now, the change in the UK and the political divide in the UK is not as sharp as, for example, in France. So essentially, Rishi Sunak, although his party has some increasingly radical elements, was a relatively centrist right leader. And Keir Starmer, the new prime minister, is a relatively centrist left leader. So the difference between Starmer and Rishi Sunak and the Labour government policy and the previous conservative policy on international affairs in general, and also on Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian arena, is not that stark. However, there is a difference, and there is a difference in tone, we've seen that affect certain decisions over the last few weeks, including a decision announced yesterday by the Israeli Foreign Minister David Lammy that that the UK will suspend the license to export certain military equipment to Israel. It's not a complete arms boycott on Israel. It's only certain specific items, but nonetheless, it's a signal by the new Labour government that it intends to be tougher, more critical, and put more pressure on Israel than the previous conservative government did. Lammy did go ahead with that. He did it quite lightly, relatively speaking, since it was very targeted. Embargo on specific arms, and when he presented it in Parliament, he tried to stress that he's still very committed to Israel's right to self-defense. The government's committed to Israel's right to self-defense. It recognizes the grave threats Israel faces from Iran and the region. Lammy even described himself as a progressive liberal Zionist. He used the word Zionist to describe himself, which is not trivial. So he tried to kind of soften it a little bit, but nonetheless, it's clear that the difference is there. A partisan difference is there, but it's not as stark in the UK as perhaps in some other countries.
Toby, is it okay if I ask 2 more questions?
Sure, fine for me.
So one question I received was, are women's rights suffering from the ideological conflict in Israel? I almost want to ask it as, how are women's rights suffering from the ideological conflict in Israel?
Yeah, so I didn't mention it specifically, but perhaps I should have. Of course, when I'm describing this deep divide in Israel between those that want to kind of, emphasize the liberal democratic character of the state of Israel and those that want to raise up kind of their interpretation of Orthodox Jewish standards and impose those on the public space in Israel. Of course, that relates very much to women's rights, has a lot of gender-related implications for it. So that's very much the subject of the struggle, of the internal struggle within the state of Israel. What will happen depends on the outcome of this internal struggle between these different tendencies in Israeli society.
So there are a few questions here about Iran, but I believe we will get to that in part 3. So I'm going to leave it for today, and I'll close with a beautifully optimistic question. Do you think there's a possibility that Israel could be destroyed?
No. The answer to that question, I think, is no. But in the sense that I don't think that Israel's enemies have the capacity to destroy it militarily in a kind of apocalyptic battle. And I don't think they have the capacity to do that either. But I think that Israel can have its morale and confidence and security eroded over the long term, greatly weakening it. And I think that threat is exacerbated by the internal divides within the state of Israel, which have weakened Israel's deterrence against its external enemies. So I think that Israel faces grave threats from that process that are in play right now, and this could have very serious consequences for Israel's strength and capacity in the years to come.
Thank you. Just before I thank you, I do want to note that, because people were asking, a recording of this program will be sent in a follow-up email alongside a lot of additional reading materials. We also have quite a few CSP programs that can be a good deep dive into some of the issues that you gave us the wider context for, so I'll include them too. Thank you everyone for being here.